Hello everyone, today we're going to be learning about the cell theory. This is a really important theory if you're learning about biology and life on Earth. So this is going to help us learn about that. Before going into this lesson, I want us to look at a standard that will help us make connections throughout the lesson. This standard wants us to investigate and explain the components of the scientific theory of cells. All organisms are composed of cells, single and multicellular. All cells come from pre-existing cells, and cells are basic units of life. In biology, cell theory is a scientific theory that states that living organisms are all made up of cells. They are the basic structural/organizational unit of organisms, and that all cells come from other cells. Now we're going to be looking at these three tenets more closely, but I think it's important for us to keep this in mind as we go through the history of cells. So, cell discovery. When we're thinking about cell discovery, we really need to look at microscopes and magnification technology that became advanced enough in the 17th century to discover cells. Now, the man who we really can credit for this initial discovery is Robert Hooke. He was able to use a microscope to examine a piece of cork, and he realized, here's the piece of cork, and he realized that the structure looked a lot like the cells that monks lived in, hence the name cells. So in this picture we can see how he might think, oh, they're all clustered together, kind of like the cells that monks lived in. And so this discovery really was the first one to examine cells. Antony Leeuwenhoek also examined cells after Hooke, and he used a microscope with improved lenses, and so that gave him a little more opportunity to look at the cells. During his observation, he saw that the cells were actually moving, and that they must be living organisms. So the motile single-celled organisms that he saw, he called them animalcules, because they looked like animals to him. And then Theodor Schwann and Matthias Schleiden are credited with developing the first two tenets of cell theory. It wasn't until later that Robert Remak noted the third section, which is that all cells are formed from pre-existing cells. This third tenet was the most controversial because a lot of people thought that cells self-generated. That was a very common belief, and now we know that to be false and that cells come from other pre-existing cells. So, our first cell theory is that all living things are composed of one or more cells. There can be single and multi-celled organisms. So single-celled organisms are organisms that only have one cell. An example of this would be the E. coli bacteria that we see right here. A lot of bacteria are actually single-celled. And then a multi-celled organisms have two or more cells. So humans are multi-celled organisms. We have trillions of cells, and we can see red blood cells right here. And we have different kind of cells all around the world. We have skin cells. A common misconception that many students have is that they think all cells are the same size. Some students might think that because all living things have cells, they might be uniform across organisms. In actuality, cells vary in size and shape depending on what the organism is and what the cell's function is. In short, cells are just as diverse as the organisms that they make up. Now I want to look at this simulation because it's really a good visual for us to see how cells are different sizes. So I'm going to pull it up here. And we can see as we go through We start at a copy being a grain of rice, and then it gets smaller and smaller as we get to see our cells. And if you notice here, the skin cell is a different shape and a much larger than the red blood cell. So those are just two examples of how cells differ in size and shape. Alright, so the second cell theory is that cells is the basic unit of structure, function, and organization in all organisms. Cells are the building blocks for all living things. Tissue, organs, and entire organisms are constructed from cells. Another misconception that students have are that non-living things have cells too. They might think that this is because as they view cells as the building blocks for everything, when in actuality, a non-living thing would generally just be made up of atoms or molecules, but cells are special to living things. So we can see in this picture here, really a tree, it's a plant that's a living thing, an animal, a baby. These are all living things. So when you think of cells, you have to make that connection with life, with living things. And then our third theory is the idea that all cells come from pre-existing living cells. So remember we were talking about self-generation. That was a very common theory way back when. And then they figured out that actually cells do not self-generate. They do not self-generate. They make copies of themselves by dividing. And so that is our final tenet of cell theory. All right, this is the end. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.